Okay, excellent. Okay, so I opened up the conversation in the last year about what is the basis of Meducha Shum, the allowance of this garlic press when it has garlic inside it. So Abaya asked Rabbah that according to you, Rabbah, that a kli shemalachta le'issa is mutter l'tzorech gufay. That's contradicted by the din that Meducha im Yesh Shum metaltanosa in love in metaltanosa. So the question was from the second half of the statement, the second half of the memory, that if the Meducha does not have Shum in it, if it doesn't have garlic in it, then it's asa. Then it's asa. That was the question of Abba and Rabbah. But incidentally, in the memory itself, you see that if it does have Shum in it, then it's mutter. And the question is, what's the basis of the heter of the kli shemalachta issa when it has Shum in it? So basically, what I'd like to do is just spend a little bit of time working through the different Rishonim. And as I mentioned, unfortunately, that I'm not going to be able to give share next week. So I'll just try and lay out the shittas of Rishonim, and then hopefully everyone will be able to work through that in my absence. So the Rashba, and I printed the Rashba in source. And then, sorry, and I should have said also, the other sort of Kimar Makom over here is the Gemara that says that the Gemara that we learned in Daf Mem Gimel on the base. The Gemara there says that's mace, that's mutal b'chama. You're allowed to one of the ways of moving the mace. The Gemara there discusses how to move the dead body, and one of the solutions the Gemara came up with was maniach of kikar otinok metalta, that you can put something non-muktza on top of it and then you can move it. And finally, the Gemara in Daf Kuf Mem Beis on the base said that lo omru kikar otinok ela lemeis bilvad, that the het of kikar otinok only applies to a mace, not to anything else, which seems to imply that at least my sort of first glance reading of the Gemara, that somehow because it has the shum inside it that stops it being mukta, is not so clear cut. My sort of instinctive analogy to the case of kikar and tinuk is more complicated than you might realize, and that's really where all the Rishonim start. So the Rashba Masugah says that the basis of the allowance when it has shum in it is not because Shum by itself helps, but because, in other words, not having any old non-Muktza object inside the Muktza entity should help, but because we see from mace that a Muktza item only helps, the non-Muktza item only helps with the mace. It's a special allowance of mace, either as Rashi said, because of Kovad Abrius, or because the Rambam said because of Adam Bahul al Meso. That's only an allowance of mace, and having the shum inside the Meducha shouldn't help because of that. But he says that the base of that is, since the pot is only also because of the melacha, and now you're using the pot, the Meducha, the press is only also because of the melacha, and now you're using the melacha for you're using the Meducha for a heter need, and therefore he says it's like a kedera, like a pot which you've got food inside. So, in other words, either one of two ways of understanding what he's saying. Either he says that this makes it into a kli shemalachta leheter. In other words, when it has the shum inside, I'm not using it as a kli shemalachta leissa. I'm using it as a kli shemalachta leheter because I'm using the kli for a mutter melacha. Or the svara he's saying is that the kli is there to serve as a garlic press, and therefore the utensil is bottled to the garlic inside it. In other words, normally, if you have something that's mutter, just because you put something non-mukta on top of it, why should it cease? Normally, if you have something which is mukta, just because you put non-mukta on top of it, why should it cease to be mukta? Why should it suddenly stop being mukta? But with a Meducha shel Shum, where the whole reason it's mukta is because it's subservient to its task, which is serving garlic, doing garlic preparation, then enochanami, if I'm using it normally by default, it's there to serve as a press, which is a melacha. But here where I'm using it to store or contain garlic inside it, pressed garlic inside it, it's serving something that's mutter. In this case, it makes sense to say that it is toffel, it's subservient, it's bottle to the non-Muktza item inside it, and therefore it isn't Muktza. So again, the basic svara that the Rashba says, and the homework will be to try and look at the nuance of the language of the Rishonim and see whether they're all saying exactly the same thing or different svaras. But the basic structure of the Rashba is, and in a moment we'll look at it inside, that he brings those who argue, who want to say that there's a general allowance of if you have something non-Muktza placed in something which is Muktza, it somehow allows the Muktza to be moved. As we see from mace, that if you put a tinuk or a kicker on top of it, the Gemara earlier in the Daf Mem in Daf Mem Gimel, in which the Gemara said that if you put something on top, Mem Gimel on base that we learned earlier, if you put something on top, a kicker or tinuk on top of a mace, it ceases to be Muktza. Says the Rashba, this is wrong because you see from the Gemara in Kuf Mem base on the base that that's only a din with a mace, and instead he says the svara is something different. Instead he says the svara is because the whole issa is because you're using it for shum, and now you're using it for something which is mutter, and therefore it becomes like a pot in which the tavshil, that which is cooked in the pot, is moved, and therefore it should be allowed. So let's have a look at the Rashba briefly inside and just try and understand it. And again, the critical svara that we need to understand is exactly what is his distinction. Why does he think that because it has shum inside? And it seems to me that there are two svaras you could say. Either he's saying that normally it's a klisha melachto le'issa, but here it becomes a klisha melachto le'heta, because you're using it not to crush garlic, which is a melacha, but you're using it to store garlic, which is a mutter thing to do. Or he's saying a svara that normally kalim don't become demuxified just because you're putting a non-muktzah item on top of them, just because you put a kicker or a tinuk on top of them. But over here, where the whole purpose of the keli is to be a utensil to serve garlic preparation and garlic serving, and in that case, the keli is indeed, tafel is indeed insignificant and drawn after the status of the shum that's inside it.
May I just clarify that in the case of the mace, the kicker or tinnik have been put on Shabbat itself, whilst in the case, am I right in assuming that the garlic is there ben hashmashot at least?
We will get to that later to see if that's a critical factor. It may depend on the lomdus of how the garlic helps the utensil, whether it would even help on Shabbos or only before Shabbos. I think your assumption is reasonable. The simplest understanding when the Gemara says that when the Memra, says the Brisa says that there's shum inside, the simplest understanding is you crushed shum before Shabbos, and now you've left the shum inside to serve on Shabbos. That's certainly the simplest reading of Gemara. In which case, it's talking about when it's before Shabbos.
Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense because they've test me sure you can't do the crushing on Shabbat, obviously.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely right. Okay. So, but we'll see later whether that's a critical difference or not. Yeah.
Can I just then ask on that, because Edward and I were discussing perhaps that this is the garlic press thing has a sort of a primary purpose of
either you or Usher are comfortable to show yourselves. It's easier for me to. I find it hard giving share on Zoom only. So if you're comfortable, obviously, if not. But if you can, then I'd be grateful. Yeah.
Okay. Go on.
Wonderful.
The garlic press obviously has a sort of primary purpose and a secondary purpose. The primary purpose is being sort of crushing the garlic, but the secondary purpose being a sort of almost a container for the garlic once it has been crushed. And even if that normally is only relatively short-lived and you might move it into something else, it still is a sort of secondary purpose of the garlic press or the mortar or whatever it might be. So we wondered actually if it was just you could use something for its secondary purpose as well as for its primary purpose. So if it was a neutral thing, it was assumed to just have its primary purpose. But if you changed it, you could still change it to its secondary purpose. So you couldn't use it for something else. And that might explain why the Gemara has to bring the second case of the meat on the pestle, because clearly the pestle never has a secondary status as a meat container.
Okay, so this is it. So there's a number of ways you can say the story, and one variant of what you just said is a good version of that. You could have kalim which have two significant functions, one of which is issa and one of which is heta, and therefore it's a klisha melachta issa or heta. Now, we will look later at such things, like Kedim Shemalachton Isur Heta. And in such a case, the general rule will be that at least if a significant part of its use is Heta, that would be enough to make it a Kli Shemalachton Heta. Over here, clearly the two uses aren't equal, because otherwise, even if it didn't have Shum sitting inside it, that would be enough, because it has Shum, because it has two uses. It has a use as a Meducha, and also has a use as a Shum storer, and Shum storing is not a Kli Shemalachton Issa. So it's clear in the Gemara that it is that its primary purpose is a Kli Shemalachton Issa, and storage of Shum is not considered a significant enough use to stop it being Muktza in general terms. So that's in general terms. Nonetheless, at the moment when it's being used for a mutter use, you could argue that the secondary use of Shum is a significant enough use that when it's actually being used for that it wouldn't be considered a Kli Shemalachton Issa, because you're using it as a Kli Shemalachton Heta. Now, at least momentarily, you're redefining it as a Kli Shemalachton Heta. And that's two very different svaras in understanding what the Rashba means. We'll have to look at the nuance of the language of the Rishonim, which is when you hear the language of the Rishonim on a vague level, they're saying as follows. They're saying, normally speaking, putting a kikkar or tinuk on top of something muktzah doesn't help. However, in this case, where the whole reason it's osur is because of Shum, and you're using it for Shum, therefore it should be mutter. So there's two ways you can say what they're saying. Either they're still going with the kikkar and tinuk svara. The logic of kikkar and tinuk is that you have something which is muktzah like a mace, and you put on it a heta item, you're somehow making it subservient to the heta, and therefore it ceases to be muktzah. And then that Gemara says we only say the svara with mace, but we don't say it with other things. And on the Rashba was saying, true, you don't say it with other things generally, but where the thing in it is the very object for which the keli has been created, there it would indeed be subservient to the non-muktzah item, and therefore it would be cease to be muktzah. That's one lomdus, you could say. A second lomdus is this has nothing to do with reverse bosses. It's not because it's somehow subservient to the non-muktzah that it becomes that the keli is no longer you can move the keli because you're deemed in doing an action in the non-muktzah rather than an action in the muktzah, but rather it redefines the nature of the keli, as you said, because it has a secondary functionality. And even though the secondary functionality is not as significant as the primary functionality, and therefore it isn't always a Kli Shemalachton Heta, nonetheless, it's enough of a Kli Shemalachton Heta. It's enough of a function that when I'm actually using it for the Heta, it's a Kli Shemalachton Heta rather than a Kli Shemalachton Heta. So those are the two ways of saying the logic. So one is a logic of a type of reverse bosses that if I redefine the muktzah as a means of holding a non-muktzah item, that's enough. And even though the Gemara says we only say that's svara with mace, nonetheless the Rishonim extends it to saying that's svara when you have something significant. That's the very functionality of the keli, or it redefines the type of keli itself. Let's have a look at the Rashba inside and just see where this takes us. Yesh Shapirish. So I put that in the bold. I'm just going to mute interference. I'm just going to mute everyone. I put in the bold. Yesh Shapirish. There are those who explain. This is the middle of the Rashba in source 5. To who are din ali day kicker? That when the Gemara says that, let's start from the beginning of the paragraph. That which we learned, that's a press which has garlic in it. You can move it. Yesh Shapirish, there are those who explain. To who are din and a day kicker? That also if you have a loaf. Even though they said the Gemara says later in Kufman Beis and Beis that kicker tinuk only helps in the mace. That's only because a mace is not a keli at all. It's not a utensil at all. It's just a lump. But anything which is a keli, can be moved through a kicker. Vilesa, and this is incorrect. A kicker does not help with muktzah. It only set it with garlic or other things which are ground inside it. This is the reason since the whole reason it's also is because of melacha. And now it's the very work of the keli is to serve heta. The very thing which makes it also is that which makes it mutter. And therefore it's like a kudera that is moved with the tavshil. So what I would like to do in the Rashba is just look at the language he uses to say his svara. why it should be mutter. And then once we finish that, look at the Yesh Pirish and understand what their logic is, and understand how they justify the Gemara in Kuf Mem Beis, which seems to say not like that. So first of all, Rashi was sorry himself. He says, V'hainu Tama, this is the last two lines in that paragraph of Yesh Pirish. V'hainu Tama, this is the reason. Mishum de kiven de ein zasura ela machnos melacha. This is a keli, so why should a keli be mukta? Surely kelim are there to serve needs, and therefore why should it be mukta? And the answer is, it's only also because of melacha, because the keli has a melacha that it does. The keli has a functionality that it does, and its functionality is an issa, and therefore it's mukta. But and now I'm using the keli for heta. Therefore, that which makes it also is the very thing that makes it mutter. So I think that the simplest understanding of the language of the Rashba is that the Rashba is saying this redefines functionality, more akin, Martin, to your svara. And the Rashba isn't saying that this is somehow serving as a bossis, which should make it a reverse bossis to make it mutter. He seems to be saying it redefines the malacha, the very functionality of the keli, and that's why it ceases to be Muktza. I think that's the svara of the Rashba. Maybe we'll see in other Rishonim who say very similar language, and maybe they need another svara that normally something that's resting on something Muktza can't redefine it, but in the case of Shum, it can redefine it because that's the very purpose of the Keli. But I think in the Rashba he's talking about redefining functionality more than anything else. So that's the view of the Rashba. He before that he brought the Yesh Pirish, who says differently. The Yesh Pirish, by the way, as I mentioned, is the Rosh, and therefore a very significant halachic authority. And when you look at the Shulchan Aruch, the Rosh makes its way into Halacha L'Maisa. The Rosh says that this is comparable to, that it's lav dafka Shum. Any non-muktzah item that you put, like a kicker or a tinuk, would also help the Meducha. So the Rosh says a massive yesod lahalacha, an exceedingly important yesod lahalacha, that muktzah items that you place something non-muktzah on them, you're allowed to move them. Then the Rosh asks himself, what about the Gemara and Daf Kuf Mem Beis on a base that says that we only say the hat of kick or tinuk with a mace? Answers the Rosh that with a mace it's not a kli, whereas over here we're talking about a kli. In other words, in our language we would say as follows: the mace is muktzah machmas gufa. The mace is fundamentally not made to serve human needs. It's not a keli at all. And therefore, how would it help to put something non-muktzah on it? The mace is removed from serving human needs. It's removed from functionality. It's a lump of biomass. It's a cholol. It's a corpse. It doesn't have functionality. It's not there to serve human needs. And therefore, how would it help? You put something non-muktzah on top of it. All you have is muktzah and non-muktzah, and you're just moving muktzah and non-muktzah. How would that be mutzah? But with the keli, the whole logic of the keli is that it's mutzah, is that it's there to serve human needs. In fact, this is the reason why maybe even a muktzah keli, a kli shemach to issa, is mutzah l'sorech gufa. You have a hammer, it's a keli. Hammers are there to serve humans. And therefore, even though normally the hammer it can't be moved because the default thing is that hammer is there to set aside to not nails in, which is the melacha. Nonetheless, the hammer can be used for cracking coconuts because it's a kli shemalach to the issa, which is mutzah l'sorech gufa. Here we're asking a question on that view of Rabbah. This is Abaya's question, the view of Rabbah. But he still acknowledges that we're dealing with kelim over here. Kelim are there to serve human needs. And therefore, even if a keli isn't mutzah l'sorech gufa, if I actually use the keli to act as a tray to hold something non-muktzah, since it's a keli, therefore it's toppled to the non-muktzah item, and or to put it differently, it's serving the needs of the non-muktzah item, and therefore in essence, again, it should cease to be muktzah, I should be allowed to move it, because it's being used as a keli. It's doing what kelim are meant to do. It's being used as a keli to move the non-muktzah items. So basically, the Rosh is saying a beautiful svara, that with kelim, it helps to put something non-muktzah on top of them, because kelim are always made for human needs, and therefore they can cease to be muktzah, or at least be allowed to be moved as subservient to the non-muktzah when they're a keli. However, with non-kelim, like a mace, which is just an object in its own right that isn't there to serve human needs, that's where the Gemara says lo omru. So the Gemara that says lo omru means anything which isn't a keli, don't think you can solve by putting a non-muktzah kicker or tiluk on top of it. They only gave the allowance for the mace. Or things which are kelim, of course, you have that allowance even without the even when there isn't the same burning necessity of mace of kavod abrius or adam bol al mamono. This is the svara of the Yesh Pirish, which, as I said, is the more or less the Rosh. Now, in this svara also, I'm not entirely sure how to say it. Is the Rosh's logic, like the Rashba eventually says, that it effectively becomes a klisha melachta leheta momentarily? How so? Because I'm using it as a tray to serve the non-Muktza item. Or is the Rosh's logic that it becomes toffel, it becomes insignificant, almost nullified to the non-Muktza items on it, and therefore, because it's a keli, it's there to serve, and in this case, it ceases to be its own entity. It just becomes merely a means or a handle to move the non-Muktza item, and that's the basis of the heta. So in the Rashba, we really ask this question. The Rashba, in his own worldview, says that only with Shum does this work, and the Rashba either means that it temporarily redefines the purpose of the keli and therefore it becomes a klisha after the heta, or the alternative svara we said was that somehow it becomes toffel to the object that it's sitting on top of. And I think we can ask the same question in the Rosh's very different worldview, in which the Rosh says a lechem or a kikor or tinuk always helps with any keli. Again, we have the same question. Is it that it redefines the functionality of the keli, or is it that it becomes toffel and therefore like a bossis to the non-Muktza item, and that's the reason you're allowed to move it? And in the Rosh, as we have the language in front of us, it's not. I don't think it's entirely clear, as we have the Yesh Pirish that's quoted in front of us.
It just it feels kind of nicer to say in the Rosh that every keli is made to be a tray, may Erev Shabbos. And so if you want to use a keli as a tray, you're always welcome to use a keli as a tray. It just then turns out that the reason with a mace is different, because with a mace you have to say, like your first savara, that it becomes okay momentarily, because it just feels like the savara would be different between the mace and the keli.
Okay, you can't say that the Rosh means that every Muktza keli is only to be a tray, because that's equivalent of the Tzorech Gufa, the heta of klisha melachta issa, being allowed to use a Tzorech Gufa, in which case you can move it even before you put something on top of it. You can move it in order to use it as a tray. And the whole point of the Gemara is that Abaye is arguing on Rabbah, and he's saying that this brisa seems to say that klisha melachta issa is not mutter Tzorech Gufa. So he is at least reading the brisa saying klisha melachta issa is also Tzorech Gufa, and nonetheless the Shum helps. So you have to say it's a stronger svara. It's not. It maybe in a way it's only to be used as a tray, but only when you're actually using it as a tray. So it's more, and I only know one of two ways of saying that. Either the secondary use of a tray is a very weak use, and therefore only when you're actually using it as a tray does it become a klisha melachta leheta, or it becomes completely insignificant because it's a keli, and therefore it's just a means to move the kikor tinuk. In other words, maybe the heta is that when we look at what you're doing, your action, we say your action relates to the kikor tinuk, not to the keli. The keli is almost being moved incidentally of the kikor tinuk, not being moved in its own right.
But you have to say that with a keli shemnachta le'issa as well. So a keli shemnachta le'issa, when you're picking it up, you've got to decide what you're doing, and according to what you're doing, it becomes mutter or also just for that moment in time. So if you want to move a keli shemnachta le'issa mechama l'tzeil, you can't do that. If you want to momentarily use it to crack a nut, you can do that. And if you want momentarily to use it to hammer a nail in, you can't do that. So every decision is momentarily. So if you've got a keli, which you decide you want it to be a tray, it's only a tray because you're now using it as a tray. It doesn't become mutter. So it kind of feels...
Two points, Elio. Number one, you've just said very eloquently, Rabbah's view that klisha melachta issa can be moved to Tzorech Gufa. But Abaye is asking, is at least now learning the brisa contradicting Rabbah, and holding that klisha melachta issa you can't move the Tzorech Gufa. Nonetheless, the Meducha Shum you can. That's point number one. Point number two is with the hammer, it momentarily can be picked up the Tzorech Gufa because I'm holding it in my hands. I'm walking a mile to crack a coconut with it. With the Meducha Shum, we don't say that you can move it even when it doesn't have Shum in it, in order because you're planning to put Shum in it. We only are making when you actually have Shum in it. So you see that the heta isn't literally a klisha melachta type svara, but and in a sense this is really what Abaye is saying to Rabbah in this reading. He's saying you see that the Tzorech Gufa isn't enough to allow klisha melachta leheta. It's an issa. It's only enough when it's actually got shum inside it. And that's his question on Rabbi. You don't see that every Kli after that, and it says now. Now, what does he mean it's only mutter when it's actually inside it? Either he means that when there's something actually inside it, they already agree with you that it's a mutter b'sorach kufay, or he means no, it's a new svara in which it merely becomes like a tweezers to hold something that's mutter. It ceases to be a significant thing in its own right. Okay, we've run out of time today, so I'm afraid we'll have to stop. Apologies for the slightly late start. And Emir Hashem, this week, I'd suggest going through the Shonim. We've pretty much opened up many of the main svaras that we're going to be playing with in the Sugya. We've seen the Rosh, we've seen the Rashba, and in the Rashba himself, in each Rishon, we've opened up two ways of understanding it. And I think if you learn through the Shonim, you'll see more around that. And then I printed at the end the Halacha L'Maisa of it. And Emir Hashem, Sunday week will restart. So,
Sure, thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Thank you. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.